On an afternoon in late June of 1944 at Hollandia on the island of New Guinea in the Pacific theater of war, two men were playing an intense game of checkers, while a stranger, a tall, lanky man wearing khakis, entered and introduced himself and explained why he was there. He was interested in the combat operations of the P-38 Lightning fighter. The men playing checkers were Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group in the 5th Air Force, and his deputy. The stranger name-dropped General Donald Hutchinson, their task force commander, saying the general told him Colonel MacDonald was the man to see. "What did you say your name was, and what phases of operations are you particularly interested in?" MacDonald asked. "Lindbergh," the man replied. MacDonald realized the only way this man could get his answers was by flying the plane. "Are you a pilot?" he asked. "Yes." MacDonald looked closer at his visitor. "Not Charles Lindbergh?" "That's my name," Lindbergh replied. It was a long and surprisingly difficult route that Lindbergh took to finally get to a place where he could serve his country in wartime. You might expect that the first man to fly solo from New York to Paris would have no trouble either entering the military to fly for his country or to support its war effort in any multitude of ways. Lindbergh's problem was that he was a card-carrying member of the America First organization, whose purpose was to keep America out of the imminent wars brewing in Europe, namely Hitler's aggression. Originally called the Committee to Defend America First, its members included conservatives, liberals, Republicans, and Democrats, and even included a few members of FDR's administration. Though not unsympathetic to Great Britain's plight, Lindbergh had visited Germany in 1937, and though he met with no Nazi officials, he was given unprecedented access to the Reichsland Air Testing Station in Pomerania. This was a classified and secret establishment that no foreign air attaché had ever visited, and Lindbergh was given the red carpet treatment. Lindbergh became the first American to examine in detail Messerschmitt's Me-109, what would become one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters of the war. He was also able to examine the Dornier-17, Germany's latest bomber reconnaissance aircraft. Lindbergh was also the first to report that the Germans were also working on the Me-110, a new twin-engine fighter. From this visit, he helped Truman Smith prepare Report Number 15540, General Estimate of Germany's Air Power of November 1st, 1937. This report indicated that Germany would soon be on parity with the United States. Lindbergh realized at this speed, Germany would soon eclipse the United States in air power. And even though Franklin Delano Roosevelt campaigned on the promise to keep America out of the war, he was also very intent on supporting Great Britain in their struggle. Though Lindbergh and FDR only met once, they became almost enemies. Rather, FDR considered Lindbergh his political enemy and treated him as such, whereas Lindbergh simply did not trust FDR. So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America found itself at war, Lindbergh wanted to serve his country in any way possible. Except that by being the most public representative of the America First isolationist movement, he found that all of his bridges that might have led to serving his country had been figuratively burned in front of him by FDR. Many in America assumed because of his anti-war stance that he would have no desire to support his country. In that they were wrong, for Lindbergh admitted privately that had he been a serving member of Congress when FDR asked for a declaration of war, he would have voted in the affirmative. Before America joined the war, Charles Lindbergh had been a colonel in the United States Army Air Corps Reserve, but had resigned that commission when FDR had made a particularly nasty comment about his patriotism. Now that war was here, Lindbergh regretted that decision. In December 1941, only weeks after Pearl Harbor, he first reached out to the highest-ranking officer he knew, and that was General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces. General Arnold gave a courteous reply, but nothing ever came of Lindbergh's offer of services. Lindbergh tried again, but Arnold's aide, Major Eugene Beebe, recommended he reach out directly to the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson. Lindbergh met with Stimson, who gave him a bunch of political double talk. Lindbergh asked him to speak plainly, and Stimson admitted that he was loath to put him in any position of command because of his pre-war opinions. Stimson then misstated some of Lindbergh's position, demonstrating that he did not know what he was talking about. Nevertheless, the meeting produced a face-to-face meeting with General Arnold. However, this meeting did not produce any viable options of service within the military, as Arnold admitted he was worried about both the public's and the press's reaction to letting Lindbergh serve. What Lindbergh didn't realize was that Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, told the president that Lindbergh was a ruthless, conscious fascist, motivated by a hatred for you personally and a contempt for democracy in general. Not a single point of that statement was true. Finding that all military doors were firmly shut, Lindbergh asked and found that there was no objection to him working in the civil aviation industry. In January 1942, Lindbergh reached out to Juan Trippe at Pan American and Guy Vaughan at Curtiss-Wright. He met Trippe at the Chrysler Building in New York City on January 19th, and Trippe was excited about the many things Lindbergh could do for Pan American. Vaughan was just as enthusiastic, offering Lindbergh any position he wanted, but specifically hoping he would study their prototype aircraft. But within days, both of these offers were withdrawn. The next day, Trippe met with Lindbergh and admitted that the White House had been furious that Trippe had even brought up the idea of Pan American working with Lindbergh. Vaughan also regretfully informed Lindbergh that the situation was loaded with dynamite. Lindbergh now realized that no company with a government contract could hire him without approval from FDR's administration. Lindbergh did not give up. His cousin, Rear Admiral Emory Scott Jerry Land, chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission, got him a short meeting with Colonel William A. Wild Bill Donovan, who would soon become the director of the Office of Strategic Services. Though they discussed the idea of Lindbergh studying international air transportation, in the end, nothing came of it. Lindbergh's old friend, Phil Love, offered to bring him back into the Air Corps through the 50th Wing, which Love would be soon commanding. Except Love's superior officer squashed that idea. Eugene Wilson, president of United Aircraft, outlined several projects that Lindbergh could work on, but then it became public that United Aircraft had sold equipment to both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany prior to the war. That bad publicity made hiring Lindbergh very problematic, and the offer was withdrawn. In March of 1942, Lindbergh met with Major Reuben Fleet of the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation. Fleet had offered Lindbergh a job 9 months earlier, an offer that Lindbergh had turned down, and Fleet was now excited Lindbergh was asking to work with his company. Fleet took the offer to the management board, only to have to apologize to Lindbergh that the board could not hire him for fear of reprisals from Roosevelt. Lindbergh later learned that the president himself had declared, "I'll clip that young man's wings." The level of FDR's pettiness was shocking. The problem was that no company could afford to risk billions of dollars of defense contracts by employing Lindbergh, except maybe one, and that person was Henry Ford. Yes, that Henry Ford. Charles Lindbergh had done his solo nonstop flight from New York to Paris back in 1927 when he was 25 years old. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was 39 and married with children. He was not immediately draftable and could have easily sought deferral based on his age and his dependents. But perhaps the real question should be, how much could he really contribute? It turned out way more than you might imagine. The amount of technical knowledge and flying experience he had acquired even before he flew the Atlantic was quite extensive. Though he dropped out of college, he had studied mechanics and used that skill throughout his life. He learned to fly in 1922 and reported to Brooks Field in March 1924 for a year of military flight training. He reported with 300 hours of flight time under his belt, more than any other student, though that was not even close to the 3,000 hours of some of his instructors. During that extensive training, he also had a near catastrophic mid-air collision with another Army SE-5 during aerial maneuvers and successfully bailed out. He graduated top of his class of 18 cadets. 104 had started, training a year earlier, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Service Reserve Corps. He had hoped for an active duty commission, so instead remained in the Reserve Corps and became an airmail pilot in October 1925. At the time of his Atlantic crossing, he had over 1,100 hours of flight time in all kinds of weather, and he even held the record for the most emergency parachute jumps by any human, 4. In early 1942, Henry Ford was in the process of building the massive Willow Run factory that hoped to produce one B-24 every hour. Now, Ford hated the idea of having to ask for anyone's permission to hire someone, but at Lindbergh's insistence, they did get permission from Air Secretary Lovett. So Lindbergh finally had a job, and he dove into it with almost superhuman effort. He reported to work before dawn and went home after dark, accepting only the same pay as an active duty colonel in the Army Air Corp, which was $666.66 per month. When the plant was built and production on the massive B-24 commenced, Lindbergh could immediately see numerous ways in which the B-24 could be improved. However, he fully understood that incorporating these changes would probably not be worth the time, as quick and efficient production of these bombers was a higher priority than achieving the best quality. The motto here being, good enough for government work. On September 22, 1942, Lindbergh and some colleagues from Ford visited Dr. Walter M. Boothby, a pioneer in aviation medicine. Dr. Boothby was the head of the Aeromedical Unit for Research in Aviation Medicine at the Mayo Clinic. Lindbergh was there specifically to expand the practice of high-altitude test flight. New planes could now reach altitudes of 40,000 feet, and the dangers of high-altitude flying were not fully understood. This danger was hypoxia, caused by inadequate oxygenation of the blood. Lindbergh's colleagues were there to examine the altitude chamber at the Mayo Experimental Laboratories, and Lindbergh specifically was there to learn and be a test subject in numerous chamber rides. Now, the accepted understanding in 1942 was that hypoxia at altitude gave you no warning before you fell unconscious, meaning you would work or fly right up to the moment that you passed completely out and potentially flew your aircraft into the ground. Lindbergh did not agree with that, and working with Dr. Boothby and his staff, they devised a test where they would cut off his oxygen supply without his knowledge, but also gave him a spare working O2 system nearby that he could use if he detected his hypoxic symptoms. He successfully proved there were recognizable symptoms and recommended the use of emergency bailout oxygen equipment. This became part of the standard training for all high-altitude pilots. I used to be a halo guy or a military freefall guy back in the day, and like all Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, and Army pilots, had to go do a chamber ride as part of my certification. Besides testing and confirming your suitability for high-altitude operation, one of the primary goals was for each individual pilot, aircrew, or military freefall parachutist was to learn to recognize the symptoms of hypoxia and to immediately fix those issues. And Charles Lindbergh was one of the pioneers in that specific training. After he returned to Ford, Lindbergh put his knowledge to the test in flying the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter that was capable of reaching altitudes of 40,000 feet. In fact, one time, while flying at 36,000 feet, he recognized the symptoms of hypoxia, checked his oxygen bottle, and saw that he should be getting O2. Nevertheless, he realized he was about to pass out and pushed the stick forward to dive, and then went completely unconscious. 20,000 feet later, he regained consciousness and control of his aircraft. Safely on the ground, his mechanic informed him that his O2 system was reading 50 pounds too high. He had indeed been out of oxygen. His own familiarity with hypoxia symptoms had saved his life. Ford then modified the oxygen system on the P-47s they manufactured based on Lindbergh's recommendation, no doubt saving untold lives. Lindbergh also accepted an invitation to work with United Aircraft's new 28-cylinder engine that powered the Navy Marine Corps bought F-4U Corsair. Lindbergh made 8 trips to Hartford between December 1942 and July 1943, where he taught Navy and Marine Corps pilots the unique points of the Corsair. Since Lindbergh was a trained fighter pilot, he had the chance to fly in mock dogfights against 2 of the Marine Corps' best pilots. Lindbergh, at 41, easily outclassed both of his adversaries, each of whom were near half his age. On January 5, 1944, Lindbergh met with Brigadier General Lewis E. Wood, United States Marine Corps, about traveling to the Pacific Theater of Operations to specifically learn more of the Corsairs' combat ability in a war zone. There was a controversy at that time between twin-engine fighters and single-engine fighters concerning which type of aircraft worked best in combat. For Lindbergh, this trip could not come soon enough, as he had basically been sidelined by a hostile and obstructive administration. However, his years of work with Ford and United Aircraft had earned him a great deal of goodwill from everyone he had worked with. Lindbergh happily found that his trip to a theater of war had been approved. While arrangements were being made, Lindbergh did not waste any time and continued to test aircraft. I wish I had a list of all the planes that Lindbergh flew, but one of the most notable was the brand new, about to be fielded Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This aircraft was a revelation. It could fly faster, higher, further, and carry more bombs than any other heavy bomber. It was during this time that Lindbergh was no doubt disabused of the notion that U.S. industry could not compete with the Luftwaffe. The unbelievable growth of American air power had helped push Germany out of Africa and nearly out of Russia. Japan was losing bases throughout the Pacific as the Solomon Islands, Kwajalein Island, the Gilberts were recaptured, and the Allies were now in the process of retaking the Marshall Islands and Kuril Island. In early April 1944, Lindbergh purchased the required Navy uniforms he would wear in the Pacific Theater, though he would travel in a technical status and would wear no rank or insignia. On the 22nd of April, the Allies invaded Hollandia, New Guinea, with 84,000 troops. This, it turned out, was one of Lindbergh's ultimate destinations, and he left North Island, San Diego, for what turned out to be 2 months of travel and flying with different units before he finally reached the tent where Colonel Charles McDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, was playing checkers with his deputy. Before he met with Colonel McDonald, Lindbergh flew with the Marines over Rabaul, earning a dressing down in the process. A Marine colonel angrily told him, "You have the right to observe combat as a technician, but not to fire guns." This ass-chewing was rendered less efficient when another Marine Corps officer winked and said that it would be all right if he engaged in a target practice on his way home from a mission. Lindbergh politely listened, but still asked to go to the front lines with every single squadron he flew with. As important an aviation icon Lindbergh was, and how careful the squadron commanders were to preserve his life, the reality is both Marine Corps and Army Air Force commanders turned a blind eye whenever Lindbergh went into combat. The vast majority of Lindbergh's combat missions involved unopposed escort missions, meaning no Japanese aircraft sighted, or fighter-bomber missions through ever-present enemy anti-aircraft fire. He was under no illusions of what his bombs were doing on target, fully understanding the death that would result on the ground, something that all pilots understood to varying degrees. Lindbergh was basically a sensitive soul who fully recognized he killed Japanese ground troops in combat. Like most pilots, he did not revel in it, but accepted it as something that must be done. It was this same sensitive soul that made him such an America First proponent, because he fully understood the damage all wars wrought on both military and civilian personnel. Lindbergh flew more than a dozen combat missions with the Marines and then traveled to Hollandia, asking Colonel McDonald if he could fly the P-38 Lightning in combat. His true purpose was to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of single-engine fighters versus twin-engine fighters. Again, he could only really do that in combat, and so he did. His first combat flight with the P-38 was an escort mission with the Air Force's second leading ace, Major Thomas B. McGuire, Jr., on his wing. Though many of the 475th pilots were either nervous to fly with a man who was probably too old for this stuff, or wary of flying with this supposed pro-Nazi anti-Semite. McGuire, however, wanted to see how the old boy does. Lindbergh proved himself with the P-38, as he had with the F-4U Corsair, as an expert flyer and a dead shot with his guns during multiple strafing and bombing attacks. On July 1st, Lindbergh flew his third combat mission with Satan's Angels, and his crew chief reported to Colonel McDonald that after the entire squadron returned from its long mission, Lindbergh had 210 gallons of fuel left in his tanks, far more than anyone else in the squadron. MacDonald had Lindbergh explain how he did this in front of the entire squadron. Lindbergh then quietly and confidently explained his cruise control settings, reduced the standard 2200 RPM to 1600 RPM, set the fuel mixture to auto lean, slightly increased the manifold pressure. Lindbergh's explanation ended with his assurance that this would increase the P-38's radius by 400 miles, or make for a 9-hour flight rather than their previous 7-hour flights. The main concern of the pilots was that this would foul spark plugs and scorch cylinders. Lindbergh refuted that concern by using the P-38's technical manual, something he had obviously studied. It was Colonel MacDonald that convinced the entire wing. As pilots began to follow Lindbergh's advice, the P-38's combat range increased dramatically. The Japanese now suddenly found P-38s over bases they had previously thought safe from P-38 attacks. On 28 July 1944, Lindbergh was flying with the 433rd Squadron of the 475th Fighter Group. They departed Mockmur in the morning to escort B-25 Mitchell bombers of the 345th Bomb Group. Huge thunderheads obscured the targets, so the Mitchell bombers turned for home, while the P-38s climbed above the clouds and looked for targets of opportunity. Then, over the radio, they heard the unmistakable calls of P-38s from another group in the middle of a dogfight. The engaged P-38s were from the 9th Squadron of the 49th Group and were chasing two Mitsubishi 51 Sonyas. The Sonya was a two-place reconnaissance aircraft that had been returning to base after an escort mission. They were from the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai and were piloted by the commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, and Sergeant Saniyoshi Yokugi. Colonel MacDonald and Lindbergh were flying with the 433rd Possums, but all of the 433rd's requests over the radio for the location of this dogfight were ignored by the 9th Squadron. It was understandable. Contact with Japanese aircraft had become increasingly rare, and air-to-air kills were the ultimate yardstick of a fighter squadron's status. Simply put, the 9th Captive Squadron did not want to share, and who could blame them? The problem was that the two Japanese pilots were clearly veterans, as the calls of frustration from the engaged 9th Squadron indicated they failed to land hits on the twisting and turning Sonyas. Finally, Lieutenant Wade D. Lewis hit one of the Sonyas on the left wing, starting a fire. Lieutenant J.C. Haslip got behind the Sonya, piloted by Sergeant Yokugi, and hit it with a long burst and sent it into the sea. Captain Shimada fought off Captive Squadron for 30 more minutes, while MacDonald's flight continued to search for the dogfight. Banking around a huge thunderhead, MacDonald and Lindbergh's flight spotted the black flak and found the dogfight. They dropped their external tanks, banked into a dive to join the fight. MacDonald triggered a burst and started the Sonya smoking. Captain Danforth Danny Miller, the group's operation officer, briefly had the Sonya in his sight, but Captain Shimada pulled hard inside his turn and Miller's burst missed him by 80 feet. Captain Shimada, against all odds, went on the attack and lined up on the next pair of P-38s coming his way, specifically lining up on the lead aircraft of that element, and that was Charles Lindbergh. In all of his combat flights with both the Marines and the Army Air Force, this was the first time Lindbergh had seen a Japanese plane in the air, and now they were heading directly at each other. For pilots, this was the most dangerous way to attack. Though you didn't have much of a moving target, you had a terrific closure rate that gave you less time to line up your shot. If you turned away, the enemy would turn into you, keeping his guns on you. If you aimed directly at him, you ran the tremendous risk of having a mid-air collision. Lindbergh and Shimada's closure rate was near 600 miles an hour, and Lindbergh focused his gun sight on the Mitsubishi's radial engine. Lindbergh held the trigger for about 6 seconds, firing around 340 50 caliber rounds and 60 cannon rounds at his target. He could see hits on the Sonya, and its propeller seemed to be slowing down, but Shimada did not break off his attack. Just before impact, Lindbergh pulled back hard on the yoke, missing the Sonya by feet. The Mitsubishi poured smoke, did a half roll, and then dove for the ocean. Before it splashed, Lindbergh's number 2, Lieutenant Joseph E. Fishkiller Miller, fired off a burst, hitting the Sonya in the wing. Captain Shimada's gallant flight ended with impact with the sea. Fish Killer Miller, and take a wild guess how he earned that nickname, was quite proud of his wingman's kill and shared the story with everyone in the squadron. Of course, when Lindbergh told the story in his Midwestern drawl, he focused more on throttle settings and engine RPM. For Lindbergh, the incident was not a big deal. Only days later, on a mission over the north side of Palaus, McDonald, Lindbergh, and 2 other flyers tangled with a number of Japanese fighters, with one of them successfully getting on Lindbergh's tail and firing on him. Lindbergh hunched behind his armor plate, ready for the impact, but the Japanese pilot was such a poor shot, no rounds impacted Lindbergh's P-38. Word got out on this near miss on the iconic Lindbergh, and McDonald found himself grounded for 60 days. A few days later, Lindbergh found himself in Australia meeting with General MacArthur. Actually, this was his second meeting, and MacArthur was quite pleased to learn that Lindbergh's fuel economy discovery for the Lightning was being incorporated by all P-38 squadrons throughout the Pacific. Lindbergh returned to Marine Squadron VMF 115 at Kwajalein and Roy Islands. His purpose there was to increase the bomb load of the F-4U Corsair. In September of 1944, he went on bombing missions with a standard 1,000-pound bomb load. Within 2 weeks, he was taking off with a single 2,000-pound bomb and 2 1,000-pound bombs, which he duly dropped on a Japanese target. His modifications and recommendations were incorporated into the F-4U Corsair, turning it into a legitimate and powerful fighter bomber. It is with the Marines that Lindbergh reached 50 combat missions, and so he prepared to return home to his wife and children. Of the Navy and Marine Corps fighter aircraft that he flew, he considered the F-4U Corsair to be the best. It seems that Lindbergh's contributions to the war effort were quite extensive. It's also quite possible that his contributions in a technical advisor status were greater than what his contributions would have been had he been an active duty commander of a squadron or a group. Of course, it's unlikely FDR would even let the legendary Charles Lindbergh command a fighter squadron in a war zone for fear of losing him in combat. Even a short list of his wartime accomplishments is impressive. He improved high-altitude flying safety for military aircraft with his research on hypoxia. He improved the combat range of the P-38 Lightning by 200 miles. He increased the bomb load of the F-4U Corsair from 1,000 pounds to 4,000 pounds. Impressive work by an old man who just wanted to serve his country.